a radiogenic production.
Hi, Mark Quinn here again. So you probably know the drill by now. I worked on local radio in Bray in the late 1970s, through the 1980s and into the early 1990s, and I kept a lot of cassettes and reel-to-reel recordings of interviews with all sorts of people. Now, fortunately, with recent advancements in audio restoration, we can once again experience these unique sounds from the past. This podcast series largely draws from Bray Local Broadcasting and Horizon Radio's output and centres around interviews mostly from that period. And of course, these broadcasts weren't solo efforts. I was incredibly lucky to have Chris Conway handling the sound mixing and, crucially, Elaine Keogh as my researcher and producer. Elaine had a remarkable knack for finding fascinating guests to join me for our live Saturday morning conversations. Between 1989 and 1991, our small team put together more than 50 one-hour episodes of Quinn and Company, and the impact of our work was even recognised with a Bray Chamber of Commerce Endeavour Award in 1990, a tribute to the show that I'm still very proud of. And as we journey back to the past, I hope you enjoy revisiting these unique archive conversations. In 1987, instead of broadcasting from our usual studio setup, I took the recording equipment out on location to the home of a man whose name is practically synonymous with the preservation of local history, the writer, historian, and true Bray character Colbert Martin. If you've ever picked up a book about the history of our town, chances are that you've seen Colbert's name. In April of 1977, he was one of the key driving forces and founding committee members who established the Bray Cualann Historical Society, an organisation that is still thriving today. But Colbert wasn't an academic who just looked at old maps and church records. He was a storyteller who understood that the real history of a place lives in its people. His celebrated books like The Bridge Below the Town and his brilliant social history, A Drink from Broderick's Well, captured the folklore, the everyday anecdotes, and the unique family nicknames of Little Bray that otherwise would have been lost to time. Sitting down with Colbert in his own living room in 1987 allowed for a relaxed and natural environment. Less an interview, this is more a stream of consciousness from Colbert, reflecting on his life and times, with me prompting him occasionally along the way. First transmitted on the 22nd of August 1987 on BLB Radio, this is Colbert Martin.
I was born on the Green Park Road. My father had been involved in the fight for freedom, as we like to call it, the War of Independence, and he was on the run. Now, I had a baby sister at this time as well, so my mother found it a bit difficult to cope with the two of us. I was offloaded on my grandmother, who lived in a two-roomed, mud-walled cottage with a tin roof. Originally, I believe it was thatch, but they'd got awfully well off and got a tin roof. Now, why I remember the tin roof so well was, or is, that on Saturday mornings when I hadn't to go to school, I would lie in bed listening to the birds trotting across the galvanized roof. My brother has a bungalow built on the site there now, but it was a small, whitewashed inside and outside, with a hard-packed mud floor, open fireplace, and I had all the trimmings of a country existence growing up in Bray. She was a marvellous woman because, obviously, women of that generation had a philosophy of life which was all their own. She told me stories of raids. I couldn't remember them, of course. Raids being made on her cottage looking for my father, and of British soldiers turning me over in my bed with the butt of their rifle, and this kind of thing. But I remember marvellous people down there because we were smack in the middle of the Valley of Diamonds. It's nice to say that because people think you're frightfully well off, But it's really that If you get a ripple on the river and the sun on it, it's like a lot of sparkling diamonds. And that's all it is. But it's a very nice place to talk about and say you're born in the Valley of Diamonds, because people automatically conjure up visions of miners working day and night extracting diamonds in the Dargle Valley. But I have a vague recollection of bonfires being lit and prisoners being released and coming home. I can remember in Castle Street election meetings being held on a horse cab, the speaker standing on a horse cab, and they burning everything they could lay hands on, big bonfires at Old Connaught and in Castle Street. There are things like that. I remember also there was a lot of poverty down there, and this was the common bond. And there was an old fisherman lived up above us, Sam Naylor, and he was guarding the river for Lord Mead, or supposed to be. But he was extracting the salmon for his own personal use, and very often we were in benefit from Sam. Another common thing there was the poor man's chicken, the rabbit. We grew up on rabbits, and if you had rabbits for dinner today and the next door neighbour hadn't, well, you brought them in some soup and the leg of a rabbit. And there was this, too, the doors were always open. I remember in my grandmother's cottage there was a half door originally. Many things. We'd no running water like Joe, we'd the tap outside. And in frosty weather it was my job to put a sack over the tap the way it wouldn't freeze, in order that we would have water in the morning. I often went up the 55 steps of Lockman's en route as opposed to the wood up there where we always went for. We had many places. It was a wonderful place to grow up in, because you could swim and fish in the mill race. You could catch fish in it. You could go on safaris to the Dargle. So it was a kind of Huckleberry Finn existence. We built rafts and we lit fires and we boiled eels, and it was a boy's dream come true. And I can remember vaguely too these four-wheel brakes going back to Dublin on a summer Sunday evening, mostly at night, having been at the Dargle, and they all suitably inebriated, and melodeons playing and they singing, and they passing along at the back of our place, the Upper Dargle Road, And then, of course, there was the sandpit over where Industrial Yarns is, Thompson's sandpit. You had all these things that have gone, more or less. Broderick's well, of course. We were dispatched up there on hot Sundays in summer to get a can of water to have with the dinner, which was ice cold, And the displacement of people you see in the great exodus to Wolftown Square, that reduced the community considerably, and it posed problems too for people like the nuns in the convent who found their classes decimated, And then, of course, the great exodus was a most amusing episode, because there were all kinds of conveyances, and sure, God help them, some of them had no furniture to move, and they would be able to take their possessions in a wheelbarrow. But there were barrows and hand carts and ass and carts and pony and carts, all travelling at night through the main street up to the great beyond, And of course there were all kinds of stories like but the early settlers had gone up, and settled in, and they brought word back that it wasn't too bad. They spoke English up there, and the natives were friendly, and it was quite safe. So then they began to explore, and of course Lord Mead's woods suffered for firewood and all that. But there's most amusing stories told about the great exodus, and of course they were going around singing in Little Bray. Johnny McCall was the town clerk, and they had a kind of doggerel verse. We won't go, but Johnny says we have to go, And you can imagine what it meant for the people to tear up their roots and move to this place, It was probably one of the greatest achievements in this country that the biggest local authority housing scheme of that time was Wolftown Square. And in one great swoop, they eliminated the slums and moved all the people, you know. It broke a lot of their hearts because they'd known the Dergel and they knew where to go for rabbits. And there were all fields up where Fossero is now. And you never wanted for provender. There was always turnips and potatoes and fish in the river and rabbits to be caught. And when my grandmother died, then I went back into the family fold, and shortly after that, then I took off for England. But my childhood was a very happy one because it was a marvelous time, you know. Pleasures were simple. One dreadful chore, looking back on it now, it's amusing, but on Sunday after Mass, when I'd come home with my grandmother, I was quite young, I would have to play the gramophone, which you wound up. And we only had a certain number of records. And that is why, at the present day, there's certain songs that I have an intense dislike of. The Laughing Policeman, some of Jimmy O'Dea's, The Hills of I can remember them all vividly. The Hills of Donegal, and never would I ask for them to be played anywhere, you know. Now, I've written a piece in the little booklet in Little Bray about my musical education, or lack of it. My father had picked up a violin at an auction somewhere, and he passed it on to my grandmother, who forthwith decided that I should have a musical education. So I was dispatched to a Miss Watt, a Victorian lady who lived in Auburn Villas, opposite the People's Park, and she taught piano and violin. And she was a very gracious lady, and obviously had been very good looking in her day. And she'd say to me when I would arrive, of course, I had to run the gauntlet of my pals in the park, and they perched in trees and on the railings and calling out, you know, all kinds of things. And I tried to hide a violin case. But I'd get in there and she'd say, you better rest after carrying it that far, just around the corner, you know. I, of course, would jump at the suggestion. A stroke of luck one evening, she mentioned she had an uncle, a cowboy. And she also had a collection of Zane Grey's Wild West novels. So straight away, I used to borrow one at each lesson and bring it home in my violin case to read. And I reached the dizzy heights of being able to scrape the bluebells of Scotland on my Strad, you know. I'd virtually exhausted the stock of books, but my grandmother got suspicious, you know, and terminated my music lessons. But that's why, up to the present day, whenever I hear the bluebells of Scotland, I think of Zane Grey and the dusty plains of Arizona, you know. Oh, yes, we're working in Houghton's ink and polish factory, assistant to the van driver. We would go into the docks to get cases of tin plate for making polished tins. And I remember we would go to Powell's, the jelly people. Big deal. We used to get a packet of jelly each, which we'd eat raw on the way back, you know. But I remember I was bitterly disappointed with my wages at the end of the first week and severed my connection with Houghton's. 1 week, it's probably the shortest career in industry ever recorded, you know. When I reported home on Friday, I think it was, with my week's wages, I can nearly swear that what he actually said was, you get out of that place as fast as you can. You know, so I went off with him then. And he was working all around places like Odlums and Boyle's of Bushy Park. And most interesting story there, Boyle was a Protestant clergyman with a big beard who made violins. And they had a beautiful tone in their raw state. But once they were stained, they lost the tone. And my father and I spent innumerable days and nights trying to make a stain that wouldn't affect the violin. We never did. He was a painter and decorator, you see, and he had this business. And we'd get calls from these houses. He had tough times too because they didn't always want to, you know. But I remember working in the big houses and seeing them, you know, all around Bray here. And I saw that kind of life. The last place I worked in as a boy with them was Riles of Old Connaught, where there were suits of armour up the staircase, you know. I remember the butler, his name was Fred Evans, and he would be in polishing the silver in the butler's pantry, chamois gloves on. And Miss Ryle would call him, and she didn't approve of smoking. And Fred was smoking this day, and he stuffed it into the pocket of his tails, which he always wore. He was talking away to her, and she said, "Evans, I'm afraid you're on fire." But I saw the full staff there, upstairs, downstairs, up in that house, you know, cook, parlour maids, kitchen maids. It was the last I ever saw of it. But it was only afterwards I realised that what I'd seen was important, because I had seen it firsthand, how this operated, and how contented these servants were. They had a roof over their head, they'd food, clothes, little money, but they were all around the perimeter of Bray, you know. It was the end of an era, because they gradually disappeared, you know. The developers came in and bingo. But it was interesting to see, and it was a part of life, whether we liked it or not, or agreed with it. But sometimes I wonder if it wasn't a better thing, you know.
So you left your job in Hawtons after a week. You then
Mm.
worked with your father as an apprentice.
Yeah.
Were jobs hard to get in those days? Were there jobs available?
There were, but the thing about Bray at that time was, you see, there was a great tourist traffic in the summer. You would always pick up some kind of a job in the summer.
Of course, it would have been at its heyday then, would it?
Yes, it was peak, you know, great. I remember the police being called out to make the crowds go up one side of the road to Brayhead and come down the other, you know, one Sunday. And I remember, of course, Val Donegan on the bandstand, seeing him with the coons, as they call them. Dreadful, you know, entertainment of the lowest possible standard. The guest houses of yesterday have become the old folks' homes of today. It's more profitable, less work. But they were the guest houses, and you see, you had the tourists coming, and they all had their individual slots. You had the Yorkshire and the Lancashire, and you had Scotch Week, and you had the North Week, and they never seemed to overlap. You seemed to know automatically that a certain week in July, the Lancashire crowd would be here, you know? And this is accepted, and this is the drill, and it all petered away then. Well, it does, you know. We didn't keep step with the times in Bray. We should have had a caravan site. Immediately the car ferry came into being, you know. It would have stopped them from going on further. Then the cry always from the town hall is, "We haven't any money." I never heard them saying, "We have money." They have money, but it's mismanaged, you know. Not an iota, no confidence at all, because, you see, I heard a councillor saying once that if you don't play ball with the officials, you're dead. So this is the name of the game. You see, it's all been turned upside down. The officials are public servants. They're there to serve you. But it has been reversed. They now abuse you or refuse to see you. Anything but serve you. And the councillor, it's vote-catching exercise. You see, we had some great people in the past. People like Harry Stewart, H.J. Bourne. People who had the interests of the town at heart and really felt for their town. The council now doesn't. It's politics they're playing. I remember school, of course. School, I was one of Paddy Mack's boys, and I had gone to the Little Flower Hall and the Brighton Terrace Caper and wound up in the palatial building on the hill, St. Cronan's, and knew them all there. Paddy Mack was a marvellous teacher, you know. They were better teachers, or they had a better curriculum than they have now, because we did in national school Julius Caesar. and A Tale of Two Cities, Dickens, And I remember in geometry, and I find this vastly amusing, that we got as far as Pons Asinorum, the Bridge of Asses. And I asked a fellow here recently who had done his leaving in press about it, and he never heard of it. So obviously educational standards have dropped. But they were marvellous teachers, and they gave us a great, basis. You couldn't go wrong after that school, I've that to say for it.
So, moving on, if you like, you
Mm.
went on holidays to England
Instead,
at 16 and stayed there.
yeah.
What happened? What made you stay?
Well, I was staying with my uncle in Birkenhead, and I don't know, I saw some posters or something, or I got this urge, which we all get in our younger days, to see the other side of the hill and a bit of adventure. And of course, the underside of the hill is the same as this side, but you have to go over it to find out. So I stayed there, and I wound up as a boy apprentice in the RAF and was being trained in Farnborough as an air photographer. And it was mostly fairly battle planes we had. After 2 years of that, I had enough, and I came home, and things hadn't improved at all. If anything, they were worse. And then came along the war. I had a variety of jobs then, street photographer and all this kind of carry on. And
Tell me about the street photography. That must have been it must have required a hard neck, I would have thought.
it did. Well, when you're young, it doesn't matter. And when you're operating where nobody knows you, you don't care, I was cleaning up. I was operating up outside Arnott's behind a big ESB standard, which is still there. And I often stand against it and say, did I ever? Until a policeman discovered me. You weren't allowed there. But Sundays were the great days when the All-Ireland finals would be on, the country crowds. Yeah, you just had this. It was like a long box, and you just moved the lever up and down. Now, you were trained in this technique of holding it and pulling it, just dropping it down, and then a ticket out. So I used to have my lunch in town, and I was really living it up. A fella from the country and his girlfriend coming and saying, here's a capture, and you might go too quickly and maybe. But the cameras were foolproof, really, You had no focusing. There was no such thing as focusing. Once you got them within range, bang. Then I worked for a while on an ill-fated newspaper in Bray, the Saturday Newsletter. And we had an office in the main street. Numerous legal actions on our plate. We got it printed in Longford, and I was always touch and go whether it came or not. But I was a sporting correspondent and theatre correspondent. I was at a big dinner in the Gresham for the Cavan team after winning the All-Ireland final, sitting with the press there. I had free access to the gate and the Abbey theatres and all this, and I used to write them up. But it was doomed from the start because the landlord would come looking for his rent and the editor would hide under the desk, this kind of thing. And the Wicklow people were suing us, and everybody was suing us for using their name or something like this. And we'd be stuck for material, and we used to buy a Canadian magazine and copy chunks of it out and stick it into the paper, anything to get the stuff off to the printer. And there was a cartoonist there, a fella, Kevin Cochran. He's in England since. And he used to be on his wits' end looking for something for the strip cartoon, some idea, some gag. And he'd have us all demented. A great cartoonist, but he'd no imagination. He couldn't think up gags.
You also worked as a temporary postman for a while, and that was not without its perils as well.
And that was an epic occasion. It was at Christmas time. The pay was dreadful too at those days, if I remember rightly, in the post office. It was unbelievable. And whilst you worked for Christmas, you didn't get paid till after Christmas. I didn't know at the time, or I would never have gone near it, but I was on the parcel post, and I was given this big three-wheeler bike with a big hamper affair on it. And I took off across the white gates, seeing they were open and the coast was clear, top speed, and suddenly realised the brakes weren't working that well. So I jumped off and let it career on into the railings on the seafront. So I had to regretfully go back to the post office and announce that that wouldn't be operating for the Christmas, you know. So I can remember well, it was Joe Seeley's father was in charge, and I said to him, that won't be operating for the Christmas. And he said, you'll be lucky if you're operating for the Christmas, you know. Anyhow, I was now on foot in what to me was unknown territory, the New Court Road. And on the New Court Road at 12 o'clock on a Christmas Eve is not recommended. And I with the turkey and a label on it, it's making it black and blue. That was always on the turkey. And I couldn't find the house that this was destined for. So I reported back and I was just tossed into a corner. So somebody, due to my misdeeds, didn't have their Christmas dinner that year in Bray. But I didn't go near the post office after that. I'd had enough of being a postman. Then I went into the army here, or the Air Corps, or the Signal Corps. And I first of all found myself with the Irish-speaking battalion in Galway, which was a commando battalion. And you were trained as a commando. And it involves swinging across the corb on a rope and this kind of thing. I found myself in Major General Coslow's command, Southern Command. And on one occasion we were flying through Ennis in a jeep. We had a portable wireless set, and I saw an aerial flapping loose outside the house, a radio aerial, and I told the driver, pull up, and we went in and we set up there on a table, took off all the gear and put the rifles in the corner, and we were to keep track of the convoy going through and manoeuvres, what was passing. And I never found out afterwards, but I had had a feed from the woman of the house, and the other fellow was on the radio set. And he went to get some grub then, and I got on, and the door flew open, and in came Major General Costello and another officer. And he said, I was warding into the grub. He said, well, soldier, I see you've made contact in more ways than one. What transport has passed by here? So fortunately we had it. Well, he said, look, don't make a home of it here. And he went out. So the woman said, well, I have a son in the army and he might be out on the road somewhere. She loaded us up with homemade bread and apples, and our haversacks were bulging. But I was down there, became a wireless operator then, and worked in Rhinana, as they call it. And I was subsequently up in Collins Barracks, intercepting messages going out from the German embassy and all this carry on.
This was during the war, was it?
In the end, the tail end of the war.
Yes.
I was there for the end of the war, and the big tattoo on Ball's Bridge and all that. That was an interesting time because I was all over the place. I had made up my mind I was going to see Ireland at the expense of the army. And there was only one county I didn't see, Sligo. I was in the rest. Every man should, in his lifetime, learn the mechanism of the brain going through Irish. It's an uplifting experience.
In the early 60s, when the credit union started in Bray, you were a founder member. How did that come about?
Well, I'd been reading about these people's banks in Canada, and as it was part of the great cooperative movement, I was interested, and somebody told me there was a meeting in Fatima Hall, and I went down there, and I met a whole lot of people there, and they were all on the one track, and it got going, and I subsequently went around with Nora Herlihy, lecturing on it here and there. And I set up one in a printing works in Dublin for the crowd there. I wanted to switch over in Enniskerry and, of course, here. But it has gone on now to great things here, you know. Well, it was the idealism of it, you know, that there were no bosses, that the money was the people's money, and that the shareholder had as much power as the director, you know. It was through democracy.
So were there many individuals instrumental in getting the Bray Credit Union going?
Oh, yes, I remember your grandfather in particular, and I remember working with him in the house, doing the books, that kind of primitive carry-on at that time. The late Maurice Mortel, Michael Laffin, John Lavin, Dennis Crowley of the bank, Brenda Nolan, the late Vincent Nolan, Joe Lockman, Jim Flynn, all those, you know. I remember many years spent with them, and some amusing episodes too and times. But it caught on, and whilst I don't know the ins and outs, they have a computer now and all this. So when I think of your grandfather and we wading through the books, and I remember a terrible searching of the books one time to find a penny that had gone astray. And your grandfather discovered the mistake. We were working in the basement, the dressing rooms of the Little Flower Hall. Some fly fertilizer had gotten the page, and this had made the difference. Somebody had taken it to be a 1, and this upset the whole bookkeeping system. Our grandfather was scrupulous about this.
I suppose we should say, for those that wouldn't know who my grandfather is, he was William Quinn.
William Quinn,
Yeah.
Commissioner of Police, great friend of mine.
Well, also among the activities occupying a busy Colbert Martin around that time was his membership of the Bray Literary and Debating Society, which met in the International Hotel.
There we debated such burning topics. I remember one night father should help with the housework and civil war nearly broke out. The men insisted that father shouldn't, and the women insisted that father should help with the housework. But we had the late Oliver Flanagan there, and we had famous people out from Dublin all the time. Bray Cualann and Joe Seeley arrived now and again on the scene. I remember one night we were electing a social committee, and the social committee's job was to entertain the visiting speaker with very meagre funds, I might add, in the bar before the thing started. So we were filling the vacancies, and I was auditor, which is a word they use for chairman. I was auditor for 2 years, and in his absence, I had appointed Jimmy McNeve on the social committee. Well, Jimmy arrived late, and he asked that the proceedings that had gone before, he be acquainted of them. So I said, you'll be delighted to hear that you've been appointed on the social committee. And Jimmy, of course, sarcastic wit, said, I'm deeply touched to learn that. I said, well, I can assure Jimmy he'll be even more touched before the season is over, because I said the bar expenses are getting very high. That was a marvellous thing, television really killed that, But the attendance was there on Sunday night. People like the late John Cook and Hedley Wright would be there, and Jimmy McNeve, John Diagman that died, and Herbert Mercer. And the skill of debate was very good, and you get out some of these politicians, and take them down a peg or two. Oliver Flanagan was very entertaining because he entertained us to 11:30. And he said, I differ from other politicians in this respect. I'm a hook, but I admit it. And the only thing I haven't done, he said, is kiss babies and prams. And that was Oliver, dead since. But you met great people, you heard great speakers, you heard great flights of oratory, And it improved the standard of speaking in the town. Sadly missed. It's been suggested it should start again. No, there are things that never come back. They belong to the past, They must stay there. Great days.
The International Hotel seems to be, from all the people I've spoken to, the International Hotel seems to be sadly missed.
It was the social centre of Bray. And there were conferences, there were card games. You could get a haircut there, You could place a bet there. You could have a drink there. There were dances, weddings, receptions, parties, everything there. You see, it in the ordinary fellow to be able to go down into palatial surroundings, marvellous staircase inside all this beautiful decoration, and a lovely place. Oh, the greatest loss the town has ever had, I don't claim to be a literary man. I had heard of nobody thinking of putting down the story of Little Bray. So I decided to do that, They blotted out, you see, all the little cottages, all the houses, and the rest of Little Bray was in ruins after the great slum clearance and all this. So it really put the tin hat on it there. But then you see, to counteract that, you had the building in Fossero and Palermo. Well, of course, they're the same everywhere. They're soul destroying because there's no imagination. There are no amenities. There's nothing in Bray. You have all the big estates. You have Fairy Hill, Seacrest, and Churnwood. And there's not a community centre. Well, I don't mean a big elaborate place. It's only a hall.
But there wouldn't have been, say, a community centre per se in where you grew up in Little Bray.
Yes, but you see, now's a different time, and people knew And they knew there was nothing else. There was no television, very limited radio. So they had to make their own amusement. But now people are geared to entertainment being laid on in every form. They're bombarded with television, and they cannot adapt to leading a quiet life as the people did years ago through circumstances. See, it's a whole changed scene, and you've got to accept that now. You've seen it go from the humble gramophone to the record player to the stereo and now to the video. And there's a race, there's a jump in a short space of time. Now, we that knew nothing of those as children, what did we do? We played the gramophone. We read, principally, read books. And the difference was that a lot of the books for children in those times consisted mainly of print matter, which they had to read, learn to read. Compared with now, I watch them now and they're flicking over pages of comics. The visual has replaced all that, it's easy now, and to discard that. Whereas in our day, we got a book, we had to read it, and the words we didn't know we'd ask about. And we increased our vocabulary in that way, and we kept the book and it was put on the shelf. And that's why I think that learning has gone down. Real learning, there's no such thing now. It's all geared for exams.
Getting back to A Drink from Broderick's Well, which was your first book, the inspiration was Castle Street, was the changes that were taking place
there, yes, and realizing that what I had seen in my childhood and youth would never be seen again, It's a great way of not making money at writing a book. I know there are people in this town, and they maintain that I'm awfully well off with all these books. That you write a book, and the bookseller gets a third, and you get a tenth of it. I got 50 pence off each copy of Broderick's Well. But I don't mind, because with Broderick's Well, I got so much pleasure out of it. A, doing the research, going down to people's houses, hearing the stories. B, that went all over the world. And I've letters that height from people that I knew as a child that are in England or Australia or Canada. And some of them are tear-stained. And I had one particular case of a fellow, Frank Walsh, and he was in Manchester, and he rang me up. And he said, I read your book and you mentioned Bertie Mackey's cycle shop in Castle Street. And as a young fellow, I worked there. And he said old Bertie used to go on the beer, and I used to have to go down to his house for the keys to open up the shop. And tonight I lay in my bed, and in my mind's eye, I saw myself going down for the keys and opening the shop, and you brought it all back to me. I'll be home next summer, and I'm looking forward to seeing you and having a drink. He died at London Airport. He never made it home. But I've had letters, and the gladness and the happiness it brought to people. Because when you're away from home, anything from home is marvellous to get. And you see, the other thing about it is that the poor people of Little Bray never in their wildest dreams thought that their story would someday appear in print. They never thought they were worthy of that. And here suddenly they are,
You wrote another book as well, The Bridge Below the Town.
Well, this was in an effort to please younger people who said they wanted something about the latter years. But they didn't buy it the same, and they hadn't the same interest. And too much happened in Bray that time,
What's the theme of that book?
Well, it's day-to-day life in Bray. It's things like the great debate in the town hall with Dr. Noel Brown and Brendan Behan appearing in court where fell in Bray, drunk, and the war years, the emergency years, Early Devine, Stephen Rafferty, all those. And then the growth of the town, the expansion, and finishing up with a new parish, St. Fergal's, the town bursting at the seams. But it hasn't the same charisma, you see, as the first, because you're recapturing your youth and their youth. And whether it be good, bad, or indifferent, when they look back, they remember only the sunny days. They don't remember the bad days. Nobody likes to,
You said earlier that everybody wants to see what's on the other side of the hill. The far off hills are green and so on. What's made you stay in Bray all of your life? What is it about Bray that you like so much?
Well, I suppose it's the fact of my childhood, the kind of childhood I had, living in a two-room cottage, and that it was actually here in Bray, and having seen the changes in Bray, but having something to cling on to, well, I knew it in its great days, whilst I haven't the same liking for it. I've seen few places that I'd prefer to it, you know. Naturally, as one gets older, one gets more disillusioned, and the dreams of your youth quickly are dispersed, and you've got to accept that times are changing and changing very fast. Whether it's for the better or not, the town has changed. It was a very simple town one time. It was Big Bray and Little Bray, very clearly defined. Now there's 8,000 people living out around Ballywaltram, and that was about the population of Bray when I was a youngster. Now 22,000. And you see people possibly at church on Sunday, and you might never see them again. And it's a frightening thought to me that there are people in Bray I will never know. And this is the frightening thought. This, it becomes a kind of, I don't know, faceless community if you don't know people. I love going out, and nothing I enjoy more than stopping talking to people. No matter who they are, hearing their point of view or some story.
You have an interest in drama, and you take part every year in the Bray One Act Drama Festival, which is run by the Protestant Church, the
Yes.
Church of Ireland.
Mm.
And you're a Catholic.
Well, they're not complaining. Why should I? They're so generous with the money they make in the festival. They give it to various charities each year. And they could do it themselves, you know. And I was up in the old rectory one occasion, and they were presenting these 2 or 3 checks to various charities. Poor Mr. Large was alive at the time. But I was in the corner and had got rather deep, I and a Protestant friend of mine, into a bottle of sherry. And we weren't noticing what was going on until Mr. Lord said, I think, Colbert, he said, if you wish to remain a member of the Catholic Church, you should leave now, because you're actually at a meeting at the Select Vestry. Fred Lee is a great friend of mine, and Dorothy Lee, and I know them all. They know me. And I've been involved with the festival in different capacities. But apart from that, with our church then, restoring the church.
Yeah, tell me about that. How did that happen?
Well, Randall Wilson, whom you know, Randall is a great friend of mine, and Randall was telling me one day that they had to get a job done on the church. They'd got a job done on the roof, but the water over the years had leaked down the walls, and the walls were discoloured and falling. And he said, we've got a quotation for scaffolding, and it's prohibitive. And I said, what are you going to do? He said, we have to hack it all off, the whole lot. And I said, I'll tell you, I get a friend of mine, and we go down. He's retired too, a plasterer, Bert Lennon. And we went down, we had a look. And Bert told him, no, there's just here and there where it's bad, remove it. Well, we have to scaffold it all, no such thing. We decided to put, the seats can't be moved, put planking along the seats and run a scaffold on wheels all around, And we did that. And in 6 months we had the church finished, And to me, the most intriguing thing was that 99 years previously, there was a minute in the Select Vestry minute books to the effect that Vartry water was going to be connected into the church. But it wasn't for 99 years afterwards that it was. And it's now recorded in the minutes, I think, that I was responsible for implementing this minute of 99 years ago. It was during the summer this was going on, and tourists passing by saw the doors open and came in. So I had Mexicans and I had Germans and French and the American with his almighty dollar. And I took them on a conducted tour because, having written a little booklet about the wood carvers, I knew the church intimately. But the only one I ever got a tip off was an Irish fellow Catholic who came in, genuflected, blessed himself, knelt in the seat, said the prayer and said, this is a nice church, and gave me £1 when he was leaving. So Irish generosity is not over-exaggerated, But the visitor from Massachusetts was a dame in shorts, and I took her around, showed her the mosaics and the carvings. And we were making a cup of tea. It was the afternoon tea. And I said, would you like a cup of tea? And she said, yes. So she had a cup of tea with us, and she said, when I go back to Massachusetts, she said, they'll never believe that I had tea with 6 Catholic workmen working in a Protestant church.
You retired in 1985, and like a lot of people, when they retire, find yourself busier than ever.
Yeah.
What are you occupying yourself with?
Well, all the time I go around the schools lecturing. For example, I was up in St. Killian's College, and they wanted a project in the Dergal River. So I got them a survey of it that was done in '66. I got them an ordnance map, and I told them about my boyhood experiences on it, that I knew the fish and the birds, and I'd swam in it, and Huckleberry Finn. And I showed them some slides of the floods, and they translated all this into Irish, and they went down to Mullingar to the Unslogo competition, and they came back with first prize, a plaque, and 5 medals. So I was no end pleased, and the class sent me a letter. Well, I go around them, and likewise the Toastmasters, I've been to them. On Tashka, they wanted all old churches and monuments, and I was with them one night. I have to go back to them. And right now I'm getting ready for I suppose, to be the greatest slideshow in history. It will be in St. Peter's Church on the 15th of September. 100 slides, and there will be about 400 people at it. And it will be done on the altar of St. Peter's Church. Little Bray and Bray from 1890 up to the present time. I've been doing a bit of writing. I wrote a one-act play set in a nursing home in Bray. I've also just helped to get out this booklet for St. Peter's commemoration, 150 years old in September. And the other thing that I just finished is Sherlock Holmes' Adventure, set in Bray in 1894. And then I'm researching Quinn's Hotel. A booklet has to come out next year in conjunction with an Atlas of Bray, set in 1700. And Mary Davies, the cartographer out of the Royal Irish Academy, is bringing out the Atlas. And I've seen some of the maps, and it's fascinating to see a map and no Quinsborough Road on it. Just fields down the main street. So that keeps you pretty busy. But I've got now like that if I'm not doing something, I get bored very quickly. So I realize the importance of keeping busy. It's absolutely essential when you retire that you do, because I understand now how some men go to seed if they've no interest. And I think this is it. If the mind is occupied, the body follows along. It's a combination.
I suppose I have to ask you this question, but if you could live your life over again, would you do it the same?
Yes, exactly the same. I've had a marvelous time. I've met thousands of people. I've had enjoyment on the stage. I've won prizes on the stage. Okay, I write a book and I get an award. So the satisfaction. And then I get a great kick out of starting up an organization and seeing it grow. And even if I leave it, to see, like the credit union, that it's the great success it is. The Old Folks Association, the great success that it is. And I say, well, I haven't wasted my time. I've spent it well. I haven't wasted it. Although there's times I'll say to myself, I wish I was just an ordinary fellow that backs a horse, drinks a pint, and goes to see Bray Wanderers. It's so simple a life. And that's when I'm up to my neck in problems with the printer or something. And then that passes, and I say, well, carry on, do the best you can.
In 1981, you won an Endeavour Award for Broderick's Well.
Yes.
Did that bring you great pleasure? Did you feel?
It did because of what it was for. And, well, it's nice to be recognized in your own town for something you do, be it good, bad, or indifferent. But particularly, as I said, I think I said in my acceptance speech, that as a boy and I having a drink from Broderick's Well going off to rob some orchard, I little thought that someday I'd be in the Royal Hotel getting an award for writing about it.
So there it is, a life almost totally encapsulated there. That's Colbert Martin, whose passion for Bray, I think, completely shines through on that recording from 1987. Colbert passed away just a few years after our chat in 1993, but he left behind an incredible gift to the town. Today, his books, like A Drink from Broderick's Well, are considered absolute treasures of local social history. Sought-after pieces of folklore that captured the distinct spirit of Little Bray before they could fade from living memory. Meanwhile, Cualann Historical Society, that he helped to establish back in 1977, continues to actively preserve our local heritage, a living testament to Colbert's belief that a town's history belongs to its people. He was a true character, a man who ensured that the unique identity of Bray will never be forgotten. There's more archive interviews available in this podcast series, so please like and follow us. And if you'd like to make contact, our email address is radiogenicproductions@gmail.com. And thanks again for listening.